Welcome to World Talk Brief. He was a protege to Martin Luther King Jr., a founder of entire movements, a groundbreaking presidential candidate, and a self-appointed global statesman. For over 50 years, Jesse Jackson was a constant and, often controversial force in American life.
So that really brings us to the big question here. How did this man rise from the segregated South to become a trailblazer who completely reshaped American politics and civil rights for more than half a century?
All right, so let's start at the beginning, right in the heart of the civil rights movement. This is where a young, ambitious activist catches the eye of its most iconic leader, Martin Luther King Jr. This is Jackson, the protege.
His rise was just incredibly fast. In 1965, he's a student activist marching in Selma. Just 1 year later, King himself taps him to lead the Chicago chapter of Operation Breadbasket, which was the economic arm of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And by 67, he's the national director. His drive was just undeniable. Even as a young man, his personality was on full display. Get this. This quote is from a letter he wrote to Dr. King way back in 1962. It's bold, it's a little bit cynical, and it's incredibly self-assured. It really tells you everything about the ambition that would define his entire career. But that ambition, well, it created some friction. Dr. King definitely saw Jackson as a natural-born leader, but sources show that he and others in the SCLC's inner circle were often worried about Jackson's intense need for the spotlight, and this tension would end up shaping the very next chapter of his life. So after King's assassination and a falling out with the SCLC's new leadership, Jackson didn't just fade away. No way. He reinvented himself as a founder, creating new organizations that would become his power base for decades to come. So first up was Operation Push in 1971. The name stood for People United to Save Humanity, and its mission was pretty much a direct continuation of his earlier work, using boycotts and public pressure to force big corporations to open up jobs and economic opportunities for Black Americans. Then, in 1984, he launched the Rainbow Coalition, and this was a truly pioneering idea for its time. The whole goal was to build one single, powerful coalition from all these different groups that felt left behind by mainstream politics. It was a groundbreaking vision for a new American majority. And he captured this vision perfectly in his famous 1988 speech at the Democratic National Convention. He described America not as a single-colored blanket, but as a quilt of many patches, many pieces, many colors. This powerful metaphor really became the heart and soul of the Rainbow Coalition. Okay, so with these organizations giving him a national platform, Jackson set his sights on the biggest stage of all. Which brings us to part 3, the candidate, and his 2 historic bids for the presidency. And his campaigns just shattered political barriers. In 1984, he mounted the first truly credible presidential run by an African American, winning millions of votes. But it was in '88 that he really electrified the nation. He won key primaries, and for a while there was the actual frontrunner for the Democratic nomination. He proved that a Black candidate could seriously compete at the highest level of American politics. But his 1984 campaign was almost completely derailed by a major controversy. In what he thought was a private, off-the-record conversation, Jackson used the derogatory slur Jaime to refer to Jewish people, and Jaimetown to describe New York City. So, how did this private comment become a public firestorm? Well, he said it to a Black reporter for the Washington Post, who then shared it with a colleague. It wasn't even front-page news at first. It was actually buried deep inside a bigger article. But once those words were out, the impact was immediate, and it was severe. It created a massive political firestorm. And even though he apologized, the incident permanently tarnished his reputation and did significant long-term damage to his relationship with the Jewish community. But his influence went far beyond the campaign trail. And that leads us to part 4, the statesman. This is where Jackson basically operated as a kind of freelance American diplomat on the world stage. This part of his career is pretty incredible. On multiple occasions, Jackson would fly into global hotspots, often without the U.S. government's blessing, to negotiate the release of American hostages. From getting a downed pilot out of Syria in '83 to freeing POWs from Serbia in '99, he showed this amazing willingness to engage in high-stakes personal diplomacy, and he often succeeded where official channels had failed. Okay, so how do we reconcile all these different parts of his career? The protege, the founder, the candidate, the statesman. That brings us to our final section, a complex legacy.
You know, any honest look at Jesse Jackson's legacy has to acknowledge both sides of the coin. On the one hand, you have these trailblazing achievements, paving the way for candidates like Barack Obama, registering millions of voters, and fighting for the marginalized. But on the other hand, you can't ignore the constant criticisms of vanity, self-promotion, and the damage caused by his own controversial statements.
In his later years, Jackson's public life was shaped more and more by his health. He was initially diagnosed with Parkinson's back in 2017, but his condition was later identified as progressive supranuclear palsy, which is a rarer and more rapidly progressing neurodegenerative disorder.
And so, in July 2023, citing his health, Jesse Jackson officially stepped down as the head of the Rainbow Push Coalition. It really marked the end of an era, closing out more than 5 decades of his leadership at the helm of the very organizations he created. So let's go all the way back to our central question. How did this man from the segregated South reshape America? Well, maybe he answered it best himself. Thinking back on Barack Obama's victory in 2008, Jackson, who was seen weeping in the crowd that night, said Obama ran the last lap of a 60-year race. He saw his own trailblazing, his own controversial and complicated journey as the essential groundwork that made the future possible.
Subscribe to World Talk Brief for more clear, thoughtful explanations.